Hello all, and now I want to introduce comparative mythology on the channel as a new science. This video is going to mainly cover Joseph Campbell and his ambitions in the Mask of God series that he has in 4 volumes. I figured since we had just done Gene Gebser and considered his task of looking at the conscious structures in a sort of transparency in the integral stage, then perhaps we could look at someone like Joseph Campbell, meanwhile in America, who is creating a comparative mythology field that is going to look and systematize all of these different disciplines. And I want to really convey all of the different ways that Campbell uses the likes of psychology, the likes of German idealism, as we'll get into, and really puts them all together with archaeology, of course, and really psychology even, and makes it into one systematic way of looking at myth and the different entities of the hero, of the gods, as it were. And so, to start, we would look at how Campbell is influenced by the likes of Oswald Spengler or Leo Frobenius, the works of Thomas Mann, and of course, as many after the Jung and Freud dispute, if you would like. Clearly, that is going to play an influence. Joyce with the historicism of the cyclical way of seeing progress really reigns, I think, with Campbell here. And then, of course, the likes of Schopenhauer and Kant and Goethe with and really idealism and grand narratives to come out of that German tradition will show itself in Campbell's work here in the Mask of God series. But perhaps most importantly, we would actually look at his mentor with Heinrich Zimmer, who was the famous idologist at Columbia University, where they had met at around 1940. And in 1948, Zimmer has The King and the Corpse, which is a comparing of the Celtic and Indian narratives as well as Christianity. And you could see a lot of similarities in the qualities and the way the arguments play out with the likes of The Hero and a Thousand Faces with Campbell. And you can see that kind of drawn through with Heinrich Zimmer and his work. But The Mask of God is actually a 12-year timeline, really, that starts with the volume, the first volume that we're going to be doing on primitive mythology. Volume 2 is on the Oriental mythology from Mesopotamia through India and Japan. Volume 3 is the Occidental mythology, or the Western myth. In Volume 4, you have the creative mythology, which is really the Northwestern or Faustian or Scandinavian myths, which comes out of even secular literature. And the structure of the text itself really moves backward from mythology of the agrarian world in the Neolithic, going back to the shamans in the Paleolithic and the caves, and then traces, although this archaeology is now obsolete in contemporary times, but in the different stages of Homo erectus to the Neanderthals. Now, in the prologue, he asserts that this is the natural history of gods and heroes, and the first subsection, new science out of comparative mythology. And so, essentially, he wants to demonstrate for us a systematic way in the evolution of human religiosity, which goes from archaeology, history, literature, psychology, philosophy, and the history of ideas as well. And he really splices this all together in one encyclopedic way of looking at all of these disparate fields. Campbell himself, if we were going to give a little bit of backdrop, and another reason why I think it is important to talk about him on this channel, is Joseph Campbell comes from an American tradition. Same with Lewis Mumford and James Jacob, who had an academic life outside of academia. And of course, I think that in contemporary times, as I've talked about many times on this channel, it is important that we get away from the stranglehold that academia seems to have on public figures, or the intelligence circles, if you would like. And so, in some respects, I want to pay homage to how Campbell, he was not interested in playing along with the academic game, if you would like. And I think that is also important because you don't see that so often. And if you do, it is largely in, of course, thankfully, on places like YouTube or BitChute, if you would like, where intellectuals can discuss ideas and actually have their opinions be heard and carry some traction. I think a lot of academics that, of course, I talk to, and in my own personal life, well, many times you would find that simply uploading on YouTube actually gets more people to look at you than going through the grinder of academia and having a circulation among a couple of people who really don't have any application to philosophy or the greater context, if you like, of politics and culture ideas outside of their ivory tower. And I think in many regards, social media has helped give an avenue not just for dissidents, but for, of course, anonymous posters and the ability to be able to speak out and go outside of the current code and paradigm of our social institutions. And I think that's important to also highlight that here before we continue with Campbell, because I think that's important to look at in today's state of the world, if you would like. Now, returning to the text in its prologue, I want to show how Campbell discusses that by taking a history of landmarks, we are able to make possible this science of mythology and the recognition of the Bible and Greek mythology and the similar qualities of the virgin birth. Of course, you have with Leta and the swan, and Zeus impregnating Leta with the virgin birth, and of course similarly with the Virgin Mary and Christ. But of course, at the time as it's really discovered, the Greek myths, if you would like, this is just regarded really as literature. The Bible, of course, was considered to be a true event. And out of that, you really have the field of the Indo-European philology, which Campbell is indebted to with Sir William James or Franz Bopp. And they had recognized that Sanskrit and the Latin and culture seemed to have a sort of continuity to it from Ireland to India, and the societies and gods have similar qualities. The Vedic in India, or Iceland with Idra, Thor or Zeus, these are sovereign thunder rulers. And of course with the Gemini, you have the twin myths. Native American motifs always have this twin dynamic, but of course you have similar qualities in Chinese dynasties. And and if we turn to the Indo-Aryan, you have the idea of the foundation of bringing in civilization. Of course, in this time period, the Indo-Aryans were believed to have really been the bedrock of civilization, even though the Semites actually did seem to come earlier. And, the belief that they created civilization, at least that their dated archaeology, as the first generation was, as it turned out to be, the Mesopotamian with the Sumerians, and then of course later the Babylonians, Egypt, and then the satellite civilizations of Minoan and Crete. and Harappa in India. As it turns with the early Akkadians, they may have been present, of course, with the Sumerians, but not the Semites or the Indo-Aryans. And so the first universal state, of course, was Sargon of Akkad and his conquering of Persia from Lower to Upper Cyprus. Now, of course, philology that Campbell had demonstrated that he is indebted to, at least at the time, did believe that the Indo-Aryan was the first civilization, but this was just simply not the case as archaeology continued to develop. And there is, of course, evidence, however, that the Indo-Aryan was always present since about the 5000 BC mark north of the Black Sea, because, of course, we have these horse burials at Seji and the warrior burials going far back and inaugurate with the Semites. And then, of course, with the second generation in the four zones of India, Persia, Greece, and the Scandinavians. At the same time, you have the Mongolian nomads discovering Chinese civilization at around 1500 BC to 1000 BC, happening at around the same time. And so he's trying to say that, civilizations and their different generations are up and running at, roughly around the same time in these different desperate areas of the globe. And so he's trying to say that, through these timelines, we're able to establish a sort of comparativeness with the science that is coming in. And this is, of course, made possible really with the Napoleon conquest of Egypt. And then in 1921, you have the finding of the Rosetta Stone, which, of course, enabled the correct Egyptian texts going back to 2600 BC on the pyramid texts. And, of course, Uruk in the foundations of writing only were using this for bureaucratic purposes. They weren't writing myths or the spells down or anything like that. And the pyramid texts are being written, of course, if you have long followed this channel, then you know the written word, of course, is kind of used to, explicitly used to, in the case of memory and of remembering things. If you go back to Gebser and what he says about myth really being a remembering, then we could see here with the myths and the pyramid texts here, they must be so much older than just when they were written down in 2600 BC, because they're already forgetting the spells. And of course, you need to have the pharaoh's connection to the spells. And then, of course, as Campbell pays homage to the Polynesian mythology, and in 1839 with Algic and North American and Indian myths coming in, 1845 to 1850, you have the excavates with Sir Austin Henry with the Mesopotamian discoveries. And then he has a bunch of dates here. 1847 to 1865, you have the study of stone tools and the much older Stone Age than the ancient, medieval, and modern scheme we had been accustomed to. And this really brings in the Neanderthal age. And in 1865, you have the discovery of the first Neanderthal man-hunter. In 1859, you have the Darwinian theory in the origin of species. And in 1861, you have the discovery of the translations of the Mayan Popol Vuh, and is similar to the Navajo myth of the twin brothers. And of course, there's similar qualities and the same initiation, such as the North American archetype of the twin, as we mentioned earlier. And so, if we're going to look at some of the other thinkers that Campbell really uses to create this new science, we turn to Adolf Bastian, who discovered the mythic patterns such as the virgin birth, the flood, or the golden age all across the world. How does this actually happen? How do we have these similar images, these iconotypes, if you would like, springing up all across the world? And this is going to be one of the big questions that were not just something that Campbell was fascinated with, but of course a lot of his predecessors here. and he's going to, try to use these different theories for his own argument. Now, with Bastian and his theory, you have this thought to be the parallel development, which ultimately has a sort of encased boxing, if you like, of the same psychodynamics, or really biological reference, if you'd like, and you just have variants of different climates and milieus, really. However, with Bastian, he forms this hypothesis, really, of the elementary and the ethic idea distinction. So you have sort of form, this sort of skeleton, if you would like, or the architecture of how all of these images really are across time, the sort of universal, if you would like, and then the ethnic ideas is more in its sort of particular custom, and as such, you'll see how this, of course, plays into Jungian archetypes, where the elementary ideas, the universals, if you'd like, and the ethnic ideas are more particular. And so you have the ethnic origin to the experience of the universal with Jung there. And then in 1872, continuing with some of these dates here, you have the further development of the excavation of Troy in the Mycenaeans, and we add a little bit more to the Greek myth than just literature or fantasy, the sort of notion that the Bible was true, and scholastic interpretations, to the Greeks just being, regarded with just high culture, and the sort of dismissing of them even taking these myths seriously. And of course, with the excavation of Troy, we see that there may be myth involved, of course, in the storytelling property of it, but these are historical events at some point. And then we discover the first cave art in Spain, and then by 1890 you have Sir James George Fraser and the Golden Bowl, and the synthesis of all the knowledge coming in. And then in 1893 you have the Crete excavation. And then we turn to the thinker Leo Frobenius, who had the idea of the cultural circle theory, which was an alternative of the myths being produced spontaneously by structures of the human psychology being the same roughly. And he instead notices these similar circular properties through a migratory process, and you have these extension zones from the Africa landmarks to the New World. And so he has this example of the totem poles that go from Africa all the way to China and then spread out to the Northwest Pacific coast. And it's a sort of cultural diffusion that goes on in a long drawn process across all of these different zones in the world. And so Campbell himself, he is an avowed Jungian and is interpreted as such correctly, but he is a different brand, if you would like, a different breed, which, he's really open to the archetypes aren't universal or biological, but are more in that sort of diffused cultural idea. And in Symbol Without Meaning, Jung, of course, was mandala as a sort of innate, but of course there is none in the Paleolithic art, and is for Campbell an invention much later until pottery or the Sumerians, and far back as 6500 BC Mesopotamia. Now, of course, he's saying really that despite perhaps it being a very old idea, it is not necessarily this sort of a priori biological reference. The archetype is historically determined, or a form that came into being, and this is really an interrogation of those Jungian archetypes at different points. He sort of departs with that idea and leaves open that interpretation. Now, of course, with Jung, you then have Freud and his dream interpretations in 1900, which then Jung produces the 1912 libido transformations, and Freud follows with the totem and taboo in 1913. And then, of course, that solidifies their conflict. And so you're, of course, seeing the bringing into the unconscious where Freud says it was biologically orientated. Everything once associates with the psychotrauma that gets repressed, and you can sort of bring it out of that sort of body, if you would like. But of course, with Jung, however, he has a biological theory of motifs that were never conscious and emerged out of the collective consciousness, and are a sort of anagram that are spontaneously produced and can explain the similarities in comparative mythology. So, we covered a lot of groundwork in this prologue, as Campbell does in The Mask of God here. And, there's many dates and associations with really his assessment for how he's going to be able to lay out a comparative mythology as a sort of science. And as we'll get on to with chapter 2, we're going to really get into the psychodynamics of myth and how it really works with the lesson of the mask. And then we'll get further along with how myth can work as a sort of a priori. And I hope you guys enjoy and look forward to being associated with some of Campbell's ideas of myth. And make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys for the rest of the series.